Hi everyone, it's Chris here. I'm the assessor at Inemmo on the Level 4 Diploma in Business and Professional Administration. Hi everyone, I just wanted to do a short video and walk you through the command verbs that are in the assessment criteria in your assignments. This isn't just for the first assignment, this is really pretty much for all the assignments. So this video will offer you support and information whichever one of the assignments you're currently working on, because the verbs that appear in the assessment criteria reappear over and over again as you go through the different assignments and as you go through the qualification. In this particular video, I'm going to cover the ones that occur the most. So we've got identify, describe, explain, analyze, and evaluate. And I'm going to hopefully be able to explain them in a little bit more detail, but also perhaps bring them to life a little bit more. So the next time you see one of these command verbs in an assessment criteria, it'll give you a bit more of a pointer in terms of how to go about writing against the command verb. Now it's interesting because they are called command verbs because the word, for example, like explain, is saying you've got to do something, so that is, we've got to explain. The point of it being a command verb is because it's saying to pass this criteria, this is what you've got to do. So you've actually got to do that. You've got to explain in order to be able to pass. So that's why they're called command verbs. And like I say, I'm going to go through these and hopefully give some examples and give some ideas so that you can get an even better handle on what to do when you see these words within the assessment criteria. So the first one we're going to look at is identify. Now with identify, you want to show that you have recognised one or more key or significant pieces of evidence, things, ideas or problems, facts, theories or examples from a wider data set. It's recognising something. Now, if you think of something like a police lineup, an identity parade, what you would have perhaps is 10 people in a lineup. And the person is expected to pick out from the lineup or identify the person that committed the crime, let's say. The principle of identification is the same when we're writing our assignments. We are picking out from a wider data set the ones that are important or significant to whatever it is we're doing. So if we're being asked, for example, to identify learning opportunities or development opportunities, we're being asked to select or identify relevant learning opportunities from the wider data set of all the learning opportunities that might be out there, as an example. So whenever you see identify, it's not list. When we see identify, we tend to think of listing things. Now, you may well end up with a list, but the point being is that you start with a wider data set. It's like you might say, well, I'll identify the best way of learning for me. Well, you could start doing that, but you would start with the wider data set of all the different ways that you could learn, and then out of that wider data set, then you would pick or identify the ones that are most important to you. So a bit like with this slide here, as I click through, I'm identifying the little red marker in amongst all the grey ones with red heads. So I'm picking out and identifying the red ones out of the broader grey data set. So again, just to make that point about identify, I'm identifying the red ones out of the wider set if that's what I'm being asked to do. So identify is you start your answer with a broader data set and then you narrow it down by identifying the ones that are important, in other words, related to the assessment criteria that you're working on. Here's another example. If I was to say, identify the dark green chairs, right? Well, we've got lots of green and yellow coloured chairs in the picture. But if I'm going to identify the dark green ones, I can pick them out with these arrows like that. So now you can see that out of the wider data set, I'm identifying the dark green ones. So again, just to summarise that, identify, it's not just listing. Identify is very much out of a wider data set, which ones are the important ones. Okay, so that's identifying. Let's have a look at describing. So when we are describing something, we are writing about what something is like, usually what it looks like, maybe what it sounds like, maybe what it feels like, tastes like. But really, and certainly in terms of writing about management and administration and things like that, we're really after qualities and features and characteristics and things like that. So if you was to describe something to somebody who didn't know what you were talking about, what would you say? Now, descriptions can be brief, descriptions can be detailed. I admit that. In the end, you want to be able to just describe something. What does this thing look like? What are its characteristics? What are its qualities? What are its features? And that way, then, the person you're describing it to might be able to build a picture up in their mind of what it is you're talking about. So with describe, always imagine that the next reader doesn't know what you're talking about, and you need to describe it so that they can clearly understand what it is you are getting at. If you look at this slide and look at the chair, if I was say, imagine I could not see this chair and I asked you to describe it to me, I'd say, well, you'd say, what is it like? What does it look like? What are its qualities? What colour is it? What's it made of? And all those kind of things that make that chair that chair. This particular chair is clearly made of wood. It's made of pale coloured wood. Doesn't have any arms, but it has a slatted back, has 4 legs. The legs have a connector. It's got a flat seated part. You when you start describing it, you start doing a little bit more than just saying that's a chair. You go quite a little bit beyond that. So really, when you're describing something, again, just to make that point, you're trying to get the other person perhaps to visualize what it is that you're talking about. So if I couldn't see this chair and you described it to me, you'd say a number of things about its qualities and features and what it looks like. And that would allow me then to know that you know what this chair is like, but it would also help me see that chair too. Another key criterion, command verb that we see in criteria is explain. And you'll see describe a lot, but you'll also see explain a lot. And explain is another one that is used a lot in this level qualification. When you're asked to explain something, the first thing I would think of is how does it work and why? So if you're asked to explain anything in a piece of writing, you want to explain basically how it works and why so. So you want to make sure that the other person again can understand it. You want to make it easy to understand, because again, if you think about it, if somebody asks you to explain something, they usually want you to kind of give more detail and make it easier for the other person to understand it. And again, that's why I say, how does it work? What are the steps? Why so? What are the causes? Why? Why is a good way of thinking explain. Why does this happen? Explain why. Explain how. So give the steps. And, again, it might be a process, or it might be that you do something a certain way, but you would still explain. So again, when you're asked to explain something, it's not bullet points, it's not listing. It is paragraphs, and it's the same with describe, by the way. It's paragraphs where you're explaining what you're doing. All right. So we want paragraphs when you see the word explain. And think about it, this is a different type of chair. The previous type of chair, you wouldn't really explain, you would describe the previous chair. But with this chair, a deck chair, and if it was flat, I might say, well, can you explain to me, how does this deck chair work? Right? And so then you would actually start to say, well, you would do this and this and this and this. Well, why would I do that? Well, you do that because you need the bit to sit in there so that it holds straight, so it doesn't fall down when you sit on it. So again, how does a deck chair work and why? So again, if you think of the deck chair compared to the fixed chair, you get a difference between describe and explain. Now, analyze is one of the more challenging command verbs that we do see in level 4 and beyond. Analyze really is the study or examination of a complex issue in detail, identifying essential elements, causes, characteristics. You might examine how these relate to each other. You might want to help, so you can show that you understand, and analysing something will show that you understand it. You might look at the problem in different ways. You might compare and contrast it with other things. But an analysis, when you see the word analyse, it really is asking you to do some kind of detailed examination. Now, at level 4, a lot of the analysis will be characterised as basic analysis or brief analysis, which means you haven't got to write a book. But as you can see, if you're going to analyse something, then it wants you to pick it apart a bit and get into some of the detail, right? So compared to my previous chairs, this chair does look a little bit more complex. If I was to ask you to analyse the first wooden chair, there really wouldn't be much to analyse. And also with this deck chair, there wouldn't be much to analyse. But maybe with this chair, it's a bit more complex. There's a bit more going on. There's a few more features. There's a bit more you can get into. You can certainly compare it to the other chairs. You can certainly get into the idea that there is a lot to talk about with this particular chair. Maybe you could analyse this chair. Right, so again, an analysis is a complex study or an examination of a particular subject. And so you want to give that a bit of time and a bit of treatment. You want to get into it a little bit because that will allow you to show that you've analysed something and you've broken it down a little bit. So analyse is one of the more challenging criteria that we see at this level because it really does want you to get into the subject a little bit, break it down, make comparisons, talk about the characteristics, but really get into the characteristics and the causes and why they do what they do, and maybe give some examples. But really, an analysis is that detailed examination breakdown, really showing that you do understand something in much more detail. Now, to evaluate something takes it a little bit further. Whereas an analysis is a little bit more factual, perhaps, evaluate has more of an emphasis on an overall judgment of something, explaining the extent to which it is, for example, effective, useful, or true. You make an analysis about the success or quality, or, for example, an end product or outcome. Usually it's systematic and proposing improvements. Right, so often when I talk about evaluating, another way I phrase it is, how well does each part of this work? Why? And what could we do to make better? I'll say that again. How well does each part of this work? Why? And how could we make it better? And that's really what we want to do with an evaluation. When we evaluate something, we judge it. And in the end, we say, we like it, perhaps we don't like it, and this is what we think we should do. But before we get to that final judgment, we've got to do something with it, and we've got to give examples, and we've got to break the topic down. Again, it's like it's like how well does each part work and why? So again, when you're asked to evaluate something, you're being asked to do quite a lot with something, right? You're being asked to understand a little bit more, but you're also being asked to perhaps make a conclusion, but also propose an improvement or a way forward. Now, coming back to our chair idea, you can analyse chairs, you can describe chairs, you can explain how certain chairs might work. But really, if you're going to evaluate something, the reason you might need examples is because it's like, well, I can't make a judgment on how to improve it until I've perhaps interacted with it a little bit more. So what I would suggest when you come to evaluate something is you start off by saying what the thing is, whatever it is you're talking about. You say, this is what I'm evaluating. You give an overview of what it is and how it works. So basically, if you're evaluating, you start off with a bit of description and explanation, really. Once you've done that, then you can get into what works and what doesn't work. What are some of the advantages, what are some of the disadvantages, and why? What makes it so? Well, if you're working with a chair, maybe you actually need to sit and work with the chair before you can actually do anything with it. So you may need to interact with the material a little bit more so that you can actually do this. I would also suggest you give examples. So when you're talking about a concept or you're evaluating something within one of these assignments, is that you give some examples from your own experience to support what works and what doesn't work and why and how each part works, because that way you kind of build up the evidence base for the last bit, which is where you create a conclusion and you say, this chair is great because, and I would recommend you buy it, but I think it could be improved by having a shelf on the back for me to put my jacket. Just looking at the picture here, for example. So an evaluation takes everything that little bit further because it requires you at the very end to come up with a new way forward. So an evaluation always ends off with a recommendation. So let me just summarize evaluating again. So an evaluation is to ask yourself, how well does each part work and why so? What evidence supports that? What do I conclude and what do we need to do about it? How could we make it better? All right. So it's like taking an analysis and going a few steps further. But really, you can decide you like a chair for all sorts of reasons that are subjective. Whereas with an analysis, it's going to be much more objective, much more factual. You'll still have facts in an evaluation. But in the end, you might say, I just really like this chair, and I would recommend you buy one. But you might say, actually, the one thing they could do is make the arms higher. I mean, there's all sorts of things you could recommend. But in the end, that's what you want to do. You want to recommend how to make things better. So an evaluation is one of the more challenging command verbs that we do see. But again, it's not only asking you to show that you understand something, it's also showing that you can work with the material or with the information and you can make it better. Okay, so to summarise, we've covered identify, we've covered describe, we've covered explain, we've covered analyse, and we've covered evaluate. And like I say, I wanted to put it in a video so that you can watch it over and over again as you need to in support of you writing these assignments. Here's some contact information if you need to get in touch with us, and I wish you the best of luck. And I look forward to reading your assignments in the future.